start us off.
Okay, so first off, who has a definition for configuration management? Please, someone throw your hand up to save me having to talk and bore you again.
I'll take a stab at it. Programmatically managing machine state.
Once more.
Programmatically managing machine states.
Okay, yep, that is a reasonable one. I personally would define it more as a repeatable method, or idempotent. Because let's take a really simple, extreme example. A bash script is managing machine state through some form of programming. I guess you could call it bash script programming. But it needs to be repeatable. I'm going to go for that one. Let's pass down, because...
for our definition?
Yeah.
Declarative? Yeah, no, you need to declare the machine, like, well, coming from a puppet point of view, I'd like, you want to be able to describe the state of the machine, how you want it to be, and you want to be able to have everything be idempotent, meaning that you apply the same thing multiple times, it won't change. You can always just reapply the same configuration, and you always get back to the same state. Declarative is good, yeah. Don't script a bunch of things to try to get the output. Just say, I want this user to exist, and then let the configuration management tools underneath do the tricky work to, if the user's not there, make the user. If the user is there, don't do anything, that sort of thing.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, I'm hoping for some more questions from slight audience participation.
So, actually, do you want to go each explain our backgrounds, like in terms
Okay.
of what we've done?
Okay, cool. So I come from a Puppet background. I've used Puppet in my last 3 jobs, and I'm about to implement it in this one. I chose Puppet because it doesn't require me to know Ruby. It has a DSL, so a domain-specific language. Is that right? So it is very declarative because it has its own language. So it's really simple, and I've had pretty much all of my co-workers be able to pick it up. They don't need to know programming. There's no, the syntax is very simple. So that's where I come from.
Cool. So probably like many of you, I started out just as a bash scripter. I took that way too far. Probably like many of you. Then from there I went to Python, and from Python I started doing a lot of just random programming, PHP and all that. And I was at a place where I was rolling out with Casper and Monkey, and I wanted to start looking for other alternatives just to Casper primarily at the time. And I evaluated Puppet and Chef. I went with Chef. I would say that in itself, it's not a DSL. It is pure Ruby. That's actually one thing that I like about it. But each of the Chef resources, I think, are pretty easy for anyone to consume. But it's to each his own in that regard.
Yeah, we use Puppet inside of Google to manage the Mac and Linux, and beginning to do a little bit with the Windows fleet. I only do the Mac stuff, but and we're all completely standalone Puppet at this point, so we don't have, well, there do exist Puppet servers inside of Google, but they're used by a very small group of the Linux, some Linux servers, and that's about it. The Macs, we download everything and do it all locally. We went with Puppet because that was kind of the only thing 9 years ago. We were, at the time, we weren't really doing anything. It was a golden image, like, literally log on, configure it all, make an image, and then ship that out. And then suddenly, for some reason, whoever created the images, his printer is printing out random, print stuff from other people. So we finally changed that, which was good. And then we were trying to find a way to actually manage these machines because we started getting more and more of them, which at the time was, a few thousand, which now seems so small. It's crazy. So we went at the WWDC. There were some people from Puppet Labs were talking, and Nigel Kirsten and someone else from my team was there they turned up a Puppet service internally on a server quickly and did some quick changes. So we were close to, at the time, the Linux group was using CF Engine, and I'm very glad we did Puppet instead, because CF Engine's not good for this. Yeah, I mean, I like the DSL, like Graham said, that it's not pure Ruby. It's a specific language just for Puppet. It's kind of squint your eyes, it's a little Ruby-ish. There's some Rubyisms in there, but you don't need to know much to actually do the configuration. You do need to know Ruby if you started doing some more advanced stuff. If you're extending, Puppet uses something called factor to determine the machine state, and it uses those facts that factor generates to do different things in the Puppet manifests. And to write the facts are generally in Ruby, although they've since, in the last few years, they've added support for external facts, which can be written in Python or anything. So, yeah, Puppet, and it's Ruby, so I don't really like Ruby, but it's Ruby, it's fine. I avoid it when I can.
So one thing you don't like about Puppet?
One thing I don't like, it's written in Ruby. Most of my issues with Ruby is I spend almost all of my time writing Python, and Ruby is close enough. Like if it was like written in I don't know, C or anything other than Ruby, it would probably be fine. But Ruby and Python are just close enough. When you're looking at it, you're like, yeah, I know Python, I know Ruby, sure, I can figure it out. And then I end up writing very Pythonic Ruby, and I miss all sorts of things. And like the Ruby's implicit return values kill me every time. Anyway. So it's mostly Ruby, and it's mostly that I haven't spent the time to really become a Rubyist or Rubyista, whatever it is, Ruby person.
So what I don't like about Chef, I actually really enjoy the fact that it's Ruby. There was a list of things I didn't like about Chef. We fixed most of those in the last year, so feel really good about that. As far as the product goes, there's not much that I don't like about it. There's one thing I am envious of Puppet of that Chef doesn't have, which is there's no baked-in cert that gets deployed, so that would be helpful, and we have to do our own certs for that, so that would be nice. But other than that, I can't think of anything.
I also dislike the fact it's written in Ruby. If you'd asked me 18 months ago, I'd say it's because it would be really hard to scale. It was designed for servers, of which most people only have a few hundred, not thousands, but that's been fixed. So yeah, mainly it's written in Ruby.
So the DSL or the DSL that Puppet uses, since it's a strictly declarative, meaning any variable you declare can't be changed later. It's not really a variable. There's a programming word for that I can't think of. But and initially that was annoying to me. But then I sort of wrapped my head around, if you're doing that, then things get more complicated. It seems like it's a good idea at the time. I just want to overwrite this thing and not make a copy of the thing and rename it and go, yeah, well, it's not really a constant because it's complicated. Yeah. So that was initially something I didn't like, but I've sort of turned to enjoy the confines that it gives. I also like the initially I didn't like the fact that you couldn't do strict ordering, or the order of the resources that you declare them in the manifest don't matter. It only matters what you specifically say only matters the specific ordering you tell it about. Like if you say this service, this launch daemon requires these other files to exist, then the launch daemon only runs after the files have been put down. It doesn't matter where in the manifest. If it's in two different manifests, that's fine. As long as that file resource exists, then the launch daemon will run. You don't have to worry about the ordering inside the manifest or the ordering between manifests. The Puppet takes care of the dependencies on its own. So
comparison to Chef, ordering really does matter. That's actually one thing that I like about it, because you, in any given recipe or cookbook, depending on your run list, you know exactly what's going to happen in what sequence, because it's the thing right above it and the thing right above that. I also like how when it fails hard. Which what I mean is if you give it a step of you give it 10 steps and it fails on number 5, you know it's not going to try 6 through 10, which could potentially leave your machine in an unknown state. But at least with this, it says it failed at step 5, so I know that it only tried steps 1 through 5, and I'll know exactly where the problem occurred, how to fix it. With Puppet, you want to explain why that's different?
Well, again, with Puppet, since it does the dependency trees on its own, it's like this set of resources. If you have 100 resources, 90 of them are just completely independent things, and you can do them all. They can all be applied whenever they want. And since a big tenet of writing things in Puppet or any resources or types that the client uses, everything should be idempotent, meaning that if you apply the same resource 3 times in a row, the second and third time, nothing changes. It's fine. So applying things more than once, at least in the Puppet scheme, works fine. Scheme would be a better language than Ruby, actually, speaking of languages. Sorry. Yeah, so having the dependency set up, then you know that only these things, if something fails, it knows it can apply all these other things because they aren't dependent on the thing that failed. So at least from my point of view, I enjoy that better with Puppet because I know if I have a screensaver timeout settings that I want to enforce, those will get enforced every Puppet run, even if I've broken some other thing with Puppet that's breaking. Maybe I've got a bad file name or something like that.
Yeah, so that's exactly what he said. So with Chef, it would be different in that you'd pretty much want all your stuff that's very important very early in the run, because if something unimportant failed and it was before that, potentially the more important stuff wouldn't run. But it is, each resource in itself is idempotent. So we check something like 1,100 things every run, but like almost none of them run unless something needs to be updated. But yeah, do you have any questions or comments?
Yeah, sure. So I'm still in the process of moving my incumbent product and putting configuration management actually into my environment. But you two have spoken previously on removing what you had previously and introducing config management. So what were the difficult things about moving from, say, just running bash scripts or Python to moving to configuration management?
So in particular, I know exactly what the pain you're going to feel. I don't know how many current things are in your current tool, but we had a lot. Just mapping out what was currently in our environment, what it all did, and what was important and what wasn't, was a major exercise. Once we figured out that and had a prioritized list, it became much easier because we divided it amongst the team and just kind of attacked it from the highest priority down.
We went from nothing to Puppet. So I guess a bit of story time. And this is back in the day. Many things about this story are completely, and it would never happen at Google these days. But way back in the day, we had all of these Macs, hundreds of Macs. They were set up, once and handed to the user, and then off they went. They did have a Mac admin password, a local admin username, account, and password that we all knew. Actually, one of the first things I did when I started working with the Mac operations team was we found someone had written the local admin's password down on a text file in their NFS home directory that was world readable. So we're like, all right, someone needs to figure out how to change this on all of his machines, and that was trying to figure out where to put the hash and the salted SHA, expanded whatever thing. So we had to figure out how to get Puppet on all these machines. What we did is someone had put a little watcher script on all of our DHCP servers, and every time the DHCP server saw a MAC address that came from Apple hardware, it would try to SSH in with the local admin's username and password to that machine, and then install Puppet. And if it was successful, it would check that it would check that off the list and just keep going. So it was a crazy bootstrapping scheme because we had no other. We didn't want to have all of the Mac users have to show up back to the help desk and do something. So we were like, well, we have this access. And then one of the first things we did was, all right, now we can manage this local admin account and manage this password, and then eventually get rid of it. But yeah.
So I'm curious, how effective was that that script? I feel like you got all the machines.
Well,
How long did it take?
so it ran for, I think we had it running for a couple of months. Yep, sorry. How effective was the script? Do you think we got all of the machines? We had it running for a few months, and my memory is really hazy on this because this was probably 8 years ago. We had it running for a few months. We got all of the machines we cared about. Soon after that, we changed the VPN system we were using, and the installer for the new VPN package enforced that Puppet was there. So it would check if the Puppet wasn't running, if Puppet wasn't installed, you couldn't get the new VPN. So that sort of eventually we catch everything, and we turned the machines that never wanted to do Puppet. They were just sort of eventually turned into vanilla machines as far as we were concerned. They didn't have any access. It was fine.
So, funny story, we use a similar tactic when, I don't remember which version of the OS came out. It was one of the first, download from the App Store and upgrade. But it was the first paid one. So what we did was package that up, had our licensing and all that worked out, but we also injected our tools inside of it. So we let anyone install it, but then they got re-enrolled in our tools, and that really was a really effective way to make sure we got some of the straggler machines. So that was kind of cool.
Okay, so has anyone thought of a question yet?
How about
Awesome, we've got loads.
How about Monkey as configuration management?
You totally can, because that's what we're using at the moment. We call it ghetto config management.
But a lot of people are using that. They're putting everything in
Yeah,
Monkey.
I mean, you can, but you're repeating yourself because you're having to script it all. And all these tools are designed at abstracting you away from having to write the same script over and over again. I think that...
And Monkey is neither idempotent nor, unless you build it in, neither idempotent or declarative. And what I mean by that is, yes, you can say install Chrome, but if that gets removed, it's relying on the fact that that receipt was there. Well, and that might be a bad example because you could actually just say watch Chrome. But let's pretend a package full of 10 files, unless you actually build that into the receipt for it, it won't reinstall just because they removed or changed one of those files. So it's not, in my opinion, declarative in the same way or idempotent.
Yeah, I mean, with using Monkey for configuration management means you have, I don't know, pre-install scripts that verify what should be happening, and then reinstall this package, which has a post-flight script that does the thing, and then if that's the only thing you have, and it's the whole, I think if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, so maybe I'll just use this thing. But we use Monkey only to make sure that Puppet is installed and running, but beyond that, we don't do any sort of configuration management. We use Monkey solely for package management. Puppet is only for configuration management. We don't do any package management with Puppet, even though Puppet, in theory, could do some of that. It does it terribly on OS X, but Mac OS. It does better on the Linux machines because apt actually can, the package management on OS X is terrible, but I would say don't use Monkey unless you really have no other option. It's better than nothing. I mean, if you can enforce some things that way, but I would avoid it wherever possible.
Questions from other people?
Getting back to just sort of differences between Chef and Puppet, as someone who has played a bit with both, but I don't actually use any of them at any scale, my understanding is that with Puppet, the design is that you're doing everything in this declarative DSL, and then the appeal of Chef, especially to developer types, is that it's a more it's still kind of a DSL, but it's full Ruby, and it's more procedural in that sense because you're just writing procedural code at some level. So I guess what I'm wondering is there some ways in which it's less safe in the sense that you may declare one block of your code, you may declare something in your Chef recipe, and then say 10 steps later you end up doing something that actually causes the first thing to be not true or unset. Is it, in other words, I guess what I'm wondering is applying a Puppet manifest, are there ways in which it's more atomic and will sort of guarantee that all the things are satisfied versus being able to run into a situation in Chef where it might do the thing that you don't expect?
So I'll let him speak to the Puppet thing, but as far as Chef goes, you're going to set any recipe, and inside of that recipe, you can have a series of resources. If they're not interdependent, the order doesn't matter at all. right? Because it'll just do the 5 or 10 things that you told it, and that's it. If things are dependent on each other, the way you're gonna convey that dependency is putting them in a certain order. You can also do it completely out of order and have certain resources notify other resources to run, and you'll get the same exact result, I believe, as that you would if you built the dependency mapping in Puppet. Okay. So is it more dangerous? No, especially if you're using just
if you're doing everything purely in the DSL and all the relationships are explicitly set as this depends on this service depends on this package, that kind of pattern.
Yeah, you're totally safe. The normal Chef resources, if you just out of the box kind of stuff, it'll be pretty good. When you start writing, and because this is the cool part with Chef for me is within a Chef recipe, you can for loop over an array, not for loop, each over an array to generate a series of files or directories instead of having multiple directory blocks. You can create a function that calls, for each directory that's created, calls some execute block that does some other thing. I don't know what you'd want to do, but you can start to build this more like programmatic Chef code that it looks like,
like you could
DSL,
replace it by
but
just
it's truly Ruby, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Puppet tends to well, it's not really atomic because things do happen in a long list of things, and I could imagine cases where you could make Puppet fight with itself pretty easily.
Or like that it would fail halfway through and then it's still gone and done some
of
the first steps.
Sure. Well, I mean, if a resource fails, then all of the dependent resources will not even attempt themselves. Like if that fails, then all of the ones before they're like, well, I'm not going to do anything because my parent failed. You can write Puppet manifests in Ruby now. I've never done it because I don't like Ruby. But sorry, I'll stop on the Ruby hate. It's great. It's mostly just my unfamiliarity with it. So you can write Puppet manifests in Ruby now, I believe, but I've never done that. Mostly for the reasons I don't want to. I want to use the DSL because for the most part, having the limits of the DSL, the limits that the DSL puts on you, I think make for cleaner manifests, and you're less likely to shoot yourself in the foot. Whereas if I start writing things in Ruby and I'm doing, the iterations and loops and crazy things, it's much easier to lose track of what I'm actually doing. And I mean, and going back to the initial question, I can definitely see things in. You could easily set up something in Puppet where ensure Etsy MOTD has this content, also ensure private Etsy MOTD has this content. It's the same file, 2 different resources. Puppet will be like, yeah, sure, oh, no, it's now this. And then every time you run, whichever one happens to run second,
right.
Which is well, not random, but it's not declared, so anything could happen.
Thanks.
So I'd like to know if you have any opinion on MGMT, which is it's a new tool for configuration management. There's a couple of Puppet people who used Puppet before are now into developing that in Go language, which is close to Google.
No, I haven't heard of it.
Okay. It's about, I think, 10 people actively developing that, and they push it pretty hard in Europe at the moment. Probably it's European developers.
That's good. I like Go. I haven't.
Obviously, yes.
Well, no, not obviously. I mean, I only tried it. I wrote some internal tools with it, and I do enjoy. To digress a little bit, I do enjoy Go because every time you do anything in Go, you're supposed to check whether it failed or not, and then deal with the error and continue, which I really like, especially when it back to Ruby and Python, where it's just like there's an exception. I don't know. Maybe I caught them all. Maybe I didn't. Maybe some other sub-library is throwing some exception I don't know about. Everything falls apart. Whereas this, you can always just catch the thing and go, and then go on. Anyway, no, I haven't heard of management at MGMT.
Yeah, so
but
I just I think last week or so they posted that they are trying to import Puppet rules or Puppet sets over to MGMT. I don't know how the efforts are, and I have not checked out MGMT for myself.
Okay.
They want to bridge it somehow.
I'd wonder what the configuration language looks like. You said they're importing Puppet, or probably some other configuration
Yeah,
language.
probably
then, so.
something to look at in the future again.
Yeah, I mean, I gave a talk at the London conference about what we do at Google, and I always say that we're always examining what we have and deciding whether that we want to keep it, whether it's Monkey or Puppet or anything that we're doing. Usually the answer is yes. What we have is probably the best choice, or at least the least bad choice. Same thing, I guess. I mean, it'd be interesting to look at that. I'm always looking for other things. I've investigated Chef a little bit, but nothing about it was really good enough to, well, I mean, I don't want to get into sort of the sunk cost fallacy. Just because we spend a lot of effort with Puppet doesn't mean we shouldn't stop it, right? Because otherwise it's like, well, we're always going to have Puppet because you're just having more and more time. I mean, it is mentally sort of like, well, like, oh my God, changing configuration management schemes. But we're always looking at something new, so it'd be good to see. I checked a little bit with, like Ansible and Salt, but most of those tend to be more of a, all right, do this one thing on all these machines, and not like make sure this thing is the same every time, sort of scheme, which is good for lots of servers and maybe labs with machines, but less for 70,000 laptops that are, of which I think we've had 20% of our Macs are never on the corporate network. Like they've taken home and they sit in coffee shops and people's living rooms and they're never touch the corporate network. So something that requires like an actual connection to a server, that's just not gonna fly.
Okay.
So what, if anything, does a self-service component look like in your environments?
In our environment, which, as it will be, we're still going to keep Monkey. So anything which the user needs to interact with, you still got Monkey. Configuration management, well, Puppet, it doesn't have any user-facing component whatsoever. The users probably aren't aware it's there.
So for us, there's a bunch. There's Monkey, which has all the optional installs, and it's kind of like the App Store feel. We use Facebook group membership to scope Monkey installs / Chef configurations. So some Android developer starts, so he wants to go learn about the Android developer stuff, so he goes to the internal Facebook group for Android developers. And just by joining that group, we'll configure his system to be an Android developer. That's just like an example. Then
Where's the flag that allows you to determine that he's a member of that group? Where do you pull that from?
It's an internal API that we have because we know the console user. I can tie that to the Facebook user, and then okay. So then there's dot files. So there's some people that manage. I don't know. I'm gonna name a tool, Fabricator internally. And if you want your Arc configured by them, in your home directory, you say touch.arc, and that's not real, but that's an example of something. And then Chef code. Our Chef code is open to all of our employees. It's in all of our normal Git or Mercurial repositories, and same like tools, which is Fabricator to check out code. You can go look at what our standard configuration is. If you decided you wanted to change it for you could write a recipe that is your username.rb and override any of our settings, and then now it's anytime you log in, we'll do our standard stuff, but accept your overrides, and then there you're off to the races. And then there's also node customizations where you can take the serial number of your machine, create a recipe, and then we'll merge that at the end too and get you the same result. So we have to be extremely flexible, and that's how we've chosen to do it.
Our self-service is Monkey, so we backed by Simian. So all the users, any optional installs they have, any licensed software, they request an internal help desk ticket that gets approved, and then magic happens in the background, gets told Simian as the package to their local manifest. And as far as any sort of interface with the configuration management with Puppet, we have a local plist that you can write, also with an interface with a menu that we have. You can enable what we call them knobs, like don't manage. Like for a while, we were managing whether you got a Kerberos ticket every time you typed your password in or not, or refreshed the ticket. This was back when we actually used Kerberos internally, sort of stopped. But So we had a knob to enable that if you wanted it or not. So, and if the knob would be written to the plist, the factor would read the plist and make a fact saying this is enabled, and then Puppet, when it ran, would say, oh, the fact is enabled, so I'll do the stuff to authorization database and make the change, and then that'll go. So that's basically, there's a few things that we allow users, a few dozen things, I guess, that we allow users to opt in or out of in the configuration, and then everything else is, all of the self-service stuff is that's all packages. That's not configuration management done in Monkey.
And if I can squeeze another question in. So aside from the underlying configuration,
No, that's fine.
so aside from the underlying configuration that's keeping the machine in spec, are you using any other mechanisms like config profiles as part of that?
Yeah, we have profiles. We currently don't have our Macs talking to an MDM, but we are using Puppet to ensure profiles are installed on the machine, just as mobile config files. So the mobile config files get put down, and then Puppet has Brian was saying, the managed Mac stuff, the profile resource and type, that we're using internally to make sure that those profiles are always there and installed, which is doing the same sort of thing MDM does, at least as far as that component of it goes.
So yes, we use a lot of profiles, but all of the profiles are dynamically generated based on the attributes that are in the chef code, which can be user overridable. So a good example of this is what I was showing the other day with screensaver. Our default timeout is, 5 minutes, but some user could change that to 10 or 1 or whatever they wanted. And because they're going through a code review process, at least one other person, peer reviewed that. And of course, for other things, we know exactly who changed what, when, and our security team or whatever can audit that. But.
Yeah, so if you take it down to what a profile is, its basic thing, it's a file. You can manage these things. All these tools are very good at managing files, and then you just use the profiles command to say, is this profile installed? Yes or no. Yeah. So if you strip it back down, and that's the thing with most things on Mac management, I find that if you strip it down to what they really are, it's a file. We have to query against this command, look for certain output. That's how you can translate all these things into. It's pretty much, if you're managing your Macs for using bash scripts, that's what you're doing anyway. You should be checking to see if you need to do these things before you just blindly do it anyway. So it's the same thing.
I'm curious about what it would take to get you to move from the platforms you're currently on, and I'm also curious about what hallmarks you look for when you're choosing these tools, given the enormous amount of investment. If you're going to move platforms, you've got to deal with a code base you've already built up. You've got to deal with a brand new code base. What do you look for when you're choosing these tools, given the enormous investment?
Well, we are moving tools now. We have a Mac management product currently, which we are going to be removing to move to Puppet. Like I said, we've chosen Puppet because we're familiar with it. We've used it before. But to move to, let's say, we said, okay, well, let's look at Chef. All the things I've mentioned, it's can our staff use it? What is our training investment going to be? The actual moving of code is not difficult. It's getting everyone up with using it. That's, in my opinion, the hardest thing.
I'll second what he said. I guess when we were going through the process and I was going through the eval, there was a few things on the top of our list. One of them was like, can this be in-source control, which almost all configuration managers can be, but that was very high on our list. Can this easily be added to our current peer review systems? Almost all of them can be, so that wasn't a real concern. Then it came down to flexibility for me and how easy it was going to be for me to potentially rewrite the tool if necessary when I ran into bugs or assumptions that maybe that tool made that just doesn't work in my environment. And then there was a huge leaning factor for me internally because we had some great Chef resources already. I'm sure they would have been just as likely to help me with Puppet had I gone that route, but they were like super helpful with Chef, which I think helped my traction a little bit more. I had someone who was very strong with Puppet whispering in my ear, but you know, I think it's pretty much down to you and your team, and I think what you should try is kind of something that we do internally, which is code wins arguments. Don't just pick one because someone told you. Like, go play with both, live it for a little while, see what you like. If you have, you know, if you can afford the time to do that, and then pick one.
Yeah, I'd agree with most of what they said as well. I think I haven't gone through a big formal evaluation of other management choices in a while. I've just sort of casually looked at some other ones, so I haven't really thought specifically about everything I look for. I think apart from the other things they've mentioned, I'd like to not have any regressions from the things we're able to manage with Puppet now, or if we were using Chef. I wouldn't want to be able to. I wouldn't want to go backwards with what we're able to control. I'd want to have, if we're moving from Puppets, I want to make sure that it's maybe much less resource intensive or something, a lot faster to apply. Maybe works. Less likely to break. Maybe if it was if the agent was all like a compiled thing instead of running in Ruby or Python or some other interpreted code, that might be a plus. It might also be a negative depending on how things are configured. The configuration language is somewhat important, although we don't have a lot of non-engineers that ever deal with the configuration. So I enjoy the simplicity of the DSL, but only because it makes it easy to understand everything that's happening. But anyone on my team had a more complicated dealing with a more complicated configuration language wouldn't be an issue necessarily. But again, it would need to have sort of a clear reasons to be better than what we have now. I don't know if that answers your question. I guess.
At least for two of you gentlemen, I'm sorry, Graham, I'm not quite sure of your background, but two of you folks work for fairly large-sized companies. So you're large companies that use these open source tools. Could you speak a little bit about that, like how you as a developer sort of interact with open source community if you're as users and also in effect as patrons, because you guys said you were committing fixes and stuff like that. I'm curious about that relationship a little bit.
Yeah, so Google has done quite a bit of work with Puppet. Back in the day when we first started using Puppet internally, we did a lot of work getting the Puppet master side of things working much more scalable than it initially was. So a lot of contributions back up that way. Specifically for the OS X side of things, as time has gone on, Puppet has focused more on Puppet Enterprise, which is what you get when you pay Puppet, and we haven't paid them. We're just using the open source version. So the OS X support has always been sort of kind of best effort. So we've been, at least on my team, we've been working and with the other people in the community to make sure that the OS X support in Puppet stays up to date. So that's mostly it. We just feed back what we can fix, work upstream with them.
I have so much to say around this, but I wish someone else was here to answer this question. Internally, when our prod team was going through what they were going to use for their servers, a big component of what reason why they ended up going with Chef was how they viewed Chef to Chef's community. Chef is like a paid product in terms of like support, but not the actual code that you run. Almost all of it is open source. When they release features, at one point it used to go to like a special branch and then go to open source, but not anymore. It's all open source. That was like very important to the team that manages all of our servers. And then one thing I particularly like about Chef is that they have a how do you say it? Like a promise to the Chef community as a whole that they'll respond to bugs in a certain way, not just the portions that are profitable or anything like that. They say, if you report a big bug, I don't remember the exact SLA, but I like to quote a particular bug that we found that was pretty big originally whenever we first started using it, and it was fixed within 72 hours. And not like patched like with some duct tape. They completely rewrote the core provider that had mentioned had a bug. So it was great. In terms of what it's like to contribute, I started off pretty small with a couple little fixes, and then before you knew it, we between Nate and I, we actually wrote a custom provider, which they're really, really good. When I say good, hard on you when you want to land changes, but it's for a good reason, because they want you to have all these good test cases and everything. It's because they're on the hook for that code. If I get hit by a bus, they're going to fix it. I'm sure they'll loop me if I'm still around, but ultimately they're on the hook for it. So knowing that they're going to support all the stuff that I've got checked in is pretty cool.
So in general, I think in the past few years, Puppet Labs' support for OS X has got worse, but it's not as good as it was. But in general, with commercial products, if you find an issue, you submit your ticket, and they go, yeah, okay, we'll look at that. You don't know if it's going to get fixed. You have no idea. You're not necessarily very important to them. We're not IBM. We don't have 150,000 Macs or however many they have. With open source, you can fix it yourself. You can see what's going on. For the tools I use, mostly, I know the people who make them. So I trust them. I know it's going to work. And you can, like I said, you can fix it if you have the ability. And it's time or money. You have to spend one of them. And if you're spending money on a commercial product, it might get fixed, it might not. And you have no visibility into that internal process. With open source, it's open.
Sorry, just to harp on Chef again. You know how you said you don't have visibility into that process? That's what's actually kind of cool about Chef. They have a panel of what they're going to focus on around Chef in terms of where they're going to spend their dev cycles. And it's like a board, but it's consisted of like half people in the community, not just the company itself. So they help drive where the product's going. But yeah. Any other questions? Any other questions?
So on the visibility side, I'm not familiar enough with these tools to understand what that looks like, but you obviously have to stitch on some kind of human-facing component, so you've got some visibility into these reports, into these insights that these tools are providing you. What are those tools, and what do they look like?
So for the visibility for us, it's literally the code. Anyone can look at it. They can set up their own, it's called Herald rules, but it's basically a rule that says I want to monitor this particular file, which is usually used to roll new features, and they can watch that and get alerts. And I'm not expecting the average user to do that, but they could. It's mostly the engineers that care enough to want to know what's going on with their machine. Then there's so with Chef, at the end of every run, there's a handler, and you can basically, it's like a JSON blob that it compiles at the end. You can fire that anywhere. We have an internal data store where we put that in, and any user that wanted could probably look at that. It's not very interesting, but it'll say how many times Chef ran or whatever on their system. And of course, there's local logs, but I don't know exactly what you're asking, so I just went with like a shotgun.
So with Puppet, in how we're going to run it, there's PuppetDB, which contains all of the facts, the piece of information about the machine, how much RAM it got, how many CPUs it's got, et cetera, and what's happened, whether success, fails, whether things changed, whether nothing changed, which is just as important as knowing whether things have changed. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, we collect, we've at this point overextended Factor to collect a bunch of data. So we're not running Puppet directly. We have a wrapper script since we're running standalone mode. So the wrapper script downloads the manifests locally to the machine, and then expands them, verifies them, expands them, and applies them locally. And then at the end of the Puppet run, we get, like Graham said, whether changes or no changes or there was errors. We track that. We keep track of when the last time it started to run, when was the last time it successfully finished, and all the data we collect. The logs, sort of separately, the logs for everything on the machine get slurped up and sent into a log collection. We have the inventory management tool that runs as well, and that collects, amongst other things, everything that Factor reports. So everything that's in Factor, all of the facts get reported up, and we can track things that way as well. Users don't have, I mean, they have some access. They have access to all of the Puppet manifest. All of the source code is in the internal source depot. But yeah, I wasn't sure what else you were asking. If that covers the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's accessible to any engineer internally as far as that goes.
Thank you.
Thank you.